You're standing at the edge of your own life, looking at a pile of money you promised yourself you'd spend on happiness someday, but someday never came. And now you're wondering if the security you built was actually a cage you locked yourself inside? What if I told you that the very act of saving for tomorrow is killing the only moment you'll ever truly have? What if the fear of running out is precisely what's making you run out of time? This isn't about reckless spending. This is about something far more dangerous. The quiet suicide of postponed joy, the slow death of deferred living. And if you keep walking this path, you might wake up one day with a full bank account and an empty soul. The saver's paradox isn't just an economic concept. It's a philosophical trap that millions fall into without ever realizing they're caught. You save today so you can live tomorrow, but tomorrow you save again and again, until saving becomes who you are and living becomes something you'll get to eventually. Except you won't, because the psychology that makes you delay gratification for security doesn't suddenly switch off when you hit some magical number in your account. It deepens, it becomes your identity, and identity doesn't retire. Think about the last time you denied yourself something that would have brought you genuine joy, not because you couldn't afford it, but because it felt irresponsible. Because there's always a more secure version of the future that needs funding. There's always another crisis that might come, another market crash, another emergency. And so you wait, you optimize, you plan. And while you're planning the perfect life, life is happening to everyone else. They're tasting things, feeling things, living in their bodies instead of their spreadsheets. And here's the cruelest part of this paradox. The security you're chasing is an illusion. Not because the money isn't real, but because the person you're saving it for doesn't exist yet, and might never exist. You're sacrificing the only version of yourself that's actually alive for a hypothetical future self who may not even want what you're hoarding. The ancient hedonists understood something we've forgotten in our obsession with financial optimization. Epicurus didn't preach endless indulgence. He preached the intelligent pursuit of pleasure, the kind that doesn't destroy tomorrow but doesn't sacrifice today either. He spoke of natural and necessary pleasures versus the empty ones we chase out of fear and status. But somewhere between his garden and our spreadsheets, we convinced ourselves that the highest pleasure is security itself. That the feeling of watching numbers grow is superior to the feeling of being fully alive. It's not. Security is not a feeling you can have. It's a concept you can believe in. And when you trade actual felt experience for conceptual comfort, you're trading reality for fantasy. The problem is, the fantasy feels safer, because it never challenges you to actually be present, to actually feel vulnerable, to actually admit that you're alive right now and not in some optimized future. And if you've been resonating with this, maybe it's time to join the space where we go deeper every week. You know where the button is? Let's talk about what you're actually doing when you save obsessively. You're not preparing for the future. You're avoiding the present, because the present is uncomfortable. It demands things from you. It asks you to make choices without perfect information. It requires you to feel your mortality, your limitations, your actual human scale. Saving is comfortable because it's always the right answer in a world of uncertain questions. Did you make the right career choice? Doesn't matter. You're saving. Are you happy in your relationship? Irrelevant. You're building security. Do you feel alive? That's a luxury question for people who aren't being responsible. Except it's not. It's the only question. And you're using financial responsibility as a shield against it. The paradox deepens when you realize that the very traits that make you good at saving, discipline, delayed gratification, future orientation, are the same traits that disconnect you from immediate experience. You've trained yourself to always be living 3 steps ahead, to never fully arrive in the moment because there's always another moment coming that will be more important, more secure, more optimized. But that moment is a mirage. It keeps moving away from you at exactly the speed you move toward it. And the cost of chasing it is every actual moment you're not experiencing because you're too busy preparing for one that might never come. Here's what nobody tells you about deferred living. It compounds negatively. Just like interest grows your savings, psychological deferral grows your disconnection. Each time you say no to joy for the sake of security, you strengthen the neural pathway that makes you believe security is more important than joy. You become better at denying yourself, more skilled at postponement. more convinced that the responsible thing is always the thing that hurts a little bit now, for some theoretical gain later. Until hurting a little bit now becomes your baseline. Until you can't even recognize joy anymore because you've trained yourself to see it as a threat to optimization. The financial industry loves this paradox. They've built entire business models around your fear of the present. Every commercial, every advisor, every app is designed to make you feel like you're not saving enough. Like you're one unexpected expense away from catastrophe. Like enjoyment today is theft from tomorrow. And there's some truth in that messaging, which makes it more insidious. Yes, you need resources. Yes, planning matters. But when planning becomes the point, instead of the means, you've crossed into pathology. You're no longer preparing to live. You're preparing to prepare forever. Nietzsche wrote about the danger of living for some future justification, some deferred meaning. He saw it in Christianity's promise of heaven, but it applies just as much to the modern religion of financial security. When you place the meaning of your life in some future state, you make the present meaningless. You turn actual living time into mere waiting time. And a life spent waiting isn't a life. It's a dress rehearsal for a show that never opens. The curtain never rises because you're always making sure the set is perfect. The lighting is right, the script is optimized. Meanwhile, the audience of your own consciousness is sitting there, bored, wondering when something real is going to happen. And if this is landing somewhere deep, consider staying for the conversations we keep having. The subscribe button isn't going anywhere, but maybe you should click it anyway. The Saver's Paradox reveals something unsettling about how we construct meaning. We tell ourselves we're saving for experiences, for freedom, for the ability to do what we want, when we want. But when the time comes, when you theoretically have enough team, you don't suddenly become someone who spends freely and lives boldly. You become someone who's afraid of depleting what you built. The goalpost moves now. It's not about having enough to live. It's about maintaining what you have, about not going backward. And so, the paradox completes itself. You saved your whole life too by freedom, but the act of saving made you someone who's psychologically incapable of using it. This shows up in how people relate to their own pleasure. There's a guilt mechanism that activates whenever you spend on something that isn't strictly necessary. A voice that says, this money could be working for you instead of being wasted on temporary enjoyment. But that voice is operating on a broken premise. It assumes that money sitting in an account is working harder than money spent on an experience that changes you. It assumes that future security is worth more than present aliveness. And that assumption is not universal truth. It's cultural programming. It's fear dressed up as wisdom, and it's destroying your capacity to actually inhabit your life. The hedonistic philosophers weren't advocating for mindless consumption. They were advocating for intelligent pleasure, for understanding what actually brings sustained satisfaction versus empty stimulation. Epicurus made a distinction between kinetic pleasures, the active sensation of satisfying a desire, and katastematic pleasures, the stable state of having satisfied needs, and he argued that the stable pleasures were superior. But notice, both require actually satisfying something. Both require engaging with your actual felt needs in actual present time. The Saver's Paradox doesn't satisfy anything. It perpetually postpones satisfaction in the name of some ultimate satisfaction that never comes. It's an eating disorder of experience. You're starving yourself of life because you might need those calories later. What's tragic is how this pattern replicates across every domain once it takes root. You don't just defer financial pleasure. You defer emotional risk, creative expression, vulnerable connection. Anything that might cost you something now for uncertain future return gets pushed back, gets optimized away, until you're living this perfectly preserved life that was never actually lived. You're a museum of unused potential, displaying all the things you could have done if only the conditions had been perfect. Except the conditions will never be perfect. That's not how time works. Conditions change, and so do you. The person who finally feels secure enough to spend is not the same person who needed that money 10 years ago. The desires change, the body changes, the capacity for certain kinds of joy closes, and you can't get it back with money. Consider how many people reach retirement with substantial savings and absolutely no idea how to enjoy themselves. They spent 50 years postponing, and now they don't know how to stop. They don't know what they actually want because they never practiced wanting. They practiced denying. And denial is what they've become expert at. So they sit on their security and feel vaguely anxious that they should be happier than they are. That they worked for this, and it should feel like something other than just more of the same restraint, just without the job. This is the endpoint of the paradox. Not freedom, not joy. Just the absence of one form of obligation replaced by the presence of purposelessness. If you're still here, still thinking, still questioning your own patterns, maybe you belong in this space permanently. The button is there whenever you're ready. The alternative isn't financial recklessness. It's not maxing out credit cards and living in denial of tomorrow. The alternative is what we might call strategic hedonism. It's recognizing that you have a finite amount of conscious experience available to you, and that hoarding resources while depleting experience is the worst possible trade. It's understanding that the point of money is to enhance life, not replace it. And that enhancement happens in real time, not in some theoretical future scenario that requires perfect conditions. Strategic hedonism asks, what is the minimum viable security I need to not be paralyzed by fear? And what is the maximum viable experience I can have with everything beyond that minimum? It's a radically different framework. Security becomes the floor, not the ceiling, and life happens in the space above the floor. This requires something difficult, acknowledging your mortality not as abstract concept, but as immediate fact. You are dying, right now, not someday. The time between this moment and your last moment is finite and unknowable. And every moment you spend not living because you're preparing to live is a moment you don't get back. The savings account doesn't care. It will be there after you're gone, being distributed to people who will either spend it immediately or perpetuate the same paradox into another generation. But your consciousness, your capacity to feel, to experience, to be present, that ends. And when it ends, all the security in the world means nothing because there's no one there to feel secure. The philosophers of pleasure understood that death makes life meaningful precisely because it makes it finite. The Epicureans literally practiced meditating on death, not to be morbid but to wake up to the reality that living is not optional and it's not infinite. You can't save it for later. You can't accumulate it. You can only spend it. And the question is whether you're spending it consciously on things that actually matter to you or unconsciously on the fantasy of some future perfect state that will justify all this waiting, because the waiting isn't neutral. It's not like you're putting life on pause. You're living right now. This is it. And if this, the actual texture of your daily experience, feels like sacrifice and postponement, then that's what your life is, not what it will be, what it is. The psychological research on this is clear. People overwhelmingly regret the things they didn't do, not the things they did. The experiences they denied themselves, not the ones they pursued. The risks they didn't take, the joys they postponed. And yet we keep optimizing for regret. We keep choosing the path that minimizes present risk at the cost of maximum future regret. We keep acting as if safety is the highest value, when meaning, connection, and experience are what actually constitute a life worth living. Safety is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And when you make it sufficient, when you make it everything, you end up safe and empty, protected and purposeless. Here's the shift that needs to happen. You need to start treating your present self with the same consideration you treat your future self. Right now, you'll sacrifice anything for future comfort, future security. Future you gets everything, and present you gets discipline and denial. But present you is the only you that's actually experiencing consciousness. Future you is a concept, a useful fiction for planning. But when the fiction becomes more important than the reality, you're living backward. You're treating the map as more important than the territory. And the territory is your actual life, happening in actual time, with actual feelings and actual opportunities that will not repeat. And if something in you is shifting, if you're seeing this differently now, maybe you want to keep seeing things differently. The subscribe button is how that happens. The Saver's Paradox isn't just about money. Money is just the vehicle through which we enact a deeper pattern of distrust in life itself. We don't trust that things will work out. We don't trust that we'll be okay. We don't trust that joy now won't result in suffering later. And because we don't trust, we control, we hoard, we manage, we optimize. And in doing so, we create the very suffering we're trying to avoid. Not the suffering of material lack, the suffering of experiential poverty, of living a life that feels like it's always about to start but never actually does. Because you're too busy making sure the conditions are perfect, and perfect never comes. It's not a destination, it's an excuse. What would it mean to trust yourself enough to live now? Not recklessly, not stupidly, but fully. To make choices that honor both your future security and your present aliveness. To recognize that you don't have to choose between responsibility and joy. That the most responsible thing you can do is actually inhabit your life instead of managing it from a distance. To spend money on experiences that expand your sense of what's possible. To take risks that make you feel the edge of your comfort zone. To say yes to things that scare you a little bit because they matter a little bit. This isn't about consumption, it's about participation. About being an active agent in your life instead of its nervous accountant. The truth is, security is a feeling, not an amount. Some people feel secure with very little, others feel insecure with millions. The number doesn't determine the feeling. Your relationship with uncertainty does. And if your strategy for managing uncertainty is to accumulate endlessly while postponing living, you're guaranteeing that you'll never feel secure because the underlying anxiety isn't about money. It's about being alive, about being vulnerable, about the fact that you can't control outcomes no matter how much you save. And until you address that anxiety directly, no amount of money will make you feel safe enough to actually live. This is where philosophy becomes practical. The Stoics understood that the obstacle to peace isn't external circumstances, but internal attachment to control. Epicurus understood that pleasure isn't found in excess, but in the intelligent satisfaction of natural desires. Nietzsche understood that meaning comes from affirming life in all its uncertainty, not from trying to build a fortress against it. And all of them would tell you the same thing. You're wasting your life preparing to live it. You're optimizing for a game you're not playing. And by the time you feel ready, the game will be over. So what do? You start small. You practice spending on things that matter, not things that impress, not things that signal status. Things that actually create the felt experience of being alive. A meal that makes you pay attention. A trip that changes your perspective. A class that challenges you. A connection that makes you vulnerable. You practice saying yes to the life that's available right now, instead of holding out for the life you think you deserve later, because later is just now, delayed. And if you can't live now, you won't be able to live later either. You'll just have different excuses. The saver's paradox completes itself when you realize that the thing you're saving for, freedom, presence, the ability to live on your own terms, is only available now, not tomorrow, not when you retire, not when you hit some number now. And you access it not by having more, but by being more present with what is. By letting yourself feel what you feel instead of optimizing it away. By choosing experiences over accumulation. By recognizing that a life fully lived might cost you some security, and that's not just okay, it's necessary. Because security without life is just a very expensive coffin, and you're building it one deferred choice at a time. If this struck something in you, if you're ready to think differently about what you're building your life around, then stay. We do this every week. Subscribe and become part of a space where these questions don't just get asked, they get lived with. Here's what I want you to sit with. Not as advice, but as a question that might reshape everything. What if the worst thing that could happen isn't running out of money? What if the worst thing that could happen is running out of time before you ever figured out how to actually live? What if you reach the end with everything you saved and nothing you savored? What if the security you built so carefully becomes the thing you most regret because it cost you the only thing that actually matters? Your presence in your own life, your willingness to be here fully with all the risk and uncertainty and beauty that comes with actually being alive? The paradox dissolves when you realize there is no future self to save for. There's only this self right now, making choices that either honor the fullness of being alive or defer it one more day. And every day you defer, you become a little bit better at deferring and a little bit worse at living. Until one day you wake up and realize you spent your entire life preparing for a moment that you're no longer capable of experiencing. Not because you don't have the money, Because you don't have the practice. You never learned how to let go, how to trust, how to say yes, how to be here instead of somewhere else. And by then, it's too late to start. Not because you can't change, but because you won't. Because the pattern is set, the identity is formed, and you are now someone who saves, who waits, who prepares, but never someone who lives. Don't let that be you. The way out isn't complicated. It's terrifying, but it's not complicated. You start spending your life like you mean it, not money. Life, your attention, your presence, your willingness to feel things, to want things, to admit that you're here and that here matters and that later is not guaranteed. You practice joy like it's a skill you've neglected. You practice presence like it's a muscle you've let atrophy. And you stop waiting for permission from some future version of security to finally live, because that permission will never come. The only permission that matters is the one you give yourself right now, to be here, to feel this, to want this, to choose this over and over, until choosing life becomes more automatic than deferring it. That's the way out of the paradox. Not through more security, through less attachment to the idea that security is what you're here for. You're not here to be safe, you're here to be alive, and those two things are not the same. Sometimes they're not even compatible. And when you have to choose aliveness. Choose the thing that makes you feel present in your body, the thing that reminds you you're not just preparing to live, but actually living, the thing that costs you some security but gives you back yourself, because in the end, that's all you have. Not the account balance, not the plan, just this moment. This feeling, this choice, and whether you made it count. Let's go deeper into the mechanics of how this pattern takes root, because understanding the origin helps you dismantle it. Most people don't choose the saver's paradox consciously. It creeps in through cultural messaging, through watching parents sacrifice, through economic anxiety that gets normalized as prudence. You learn early that wanting things is dangerous, that pleasure is suspect, that the responsible person is the one who always says no to now and yes to later. And because this messaging comes wrapped in genuine care, in real concern for your well-being, you internalize it as truth, rather than recognizing it as one possible strategy among many. You make it your identity before you even know there were other options. The identity piece is crucial because once saving becomes who you are rather than what you do, changing the behavior feels like self-betrayal. You're not just spending money, you're violating your sense of self. You're being irresponsible, reckless, childish, all the words that were used to shape you into someone who defers and denies. And so the paradox strengthens. You can't spend freely even when you have abundance, because spending freely isn't something you do, it's something other people do. Unserious people. People who will regret it later. People who don't understand the importance of being prepared. Except those people are often happier than you, they're less anxious, more present, they have memories instead of projections, and that's what you can't forgive them for, having what you denied yourself in the name of being better. There's a morality embedded in this paradox that nobody talks about. The saver occupies moral high ground in our culture. They're responsible, forward-thinking, mature. The spender is irresponsible, impulsive, short-sighted. But what if that moral framework is just a convenient story that keeps people compliant and disconnected from their actual lives? What if responsibility to your future self shouldn't eclipse responsibility to your present self? What if the most mature thing you could do is recognize that you're a continuous being, moving through time, and that starving one version of yourself to feed another version is still self-harm, just spread across years instead of moments? The ancient hedonists weren't praised in their time. They were criticized for being pleasure seekers, for not contributing enough to society, for questioning the dominant values of sacrifice and duty. But they understood something that's been lost in translation. The pursuit of pleasure isn't about selfishness. It's about aliveness. It's about refusing to sleepwalk through existence because someone else's idea of responsibility requires it. Epicurus literally withdrew from public life to build a community focused on simple pleasures, meaningful relationships, and philosophical inquiry, not because he was lazy, because he recognized that the standard path led to a kind of death while still breathing, and he chose differently. You have that same choice right now, not later, when conditions improve, not when you hit some threshold. Now, while you're reading this, while you're feeling whatever you're feeling about your own patterns, You can choose to keep doing what you've been doing, keep saving and deferring and optimizing, and see where that leads. Or you can choose to interrupt the pattern, to do something today that your future self might disapprove of, but your present self desperately needs. Something that makes you feel alive instead of secure. Something that reminds you that you're here, you exist, you matter, and your experience of being alive is not less important than your future hypothetical comfort. And if you've been nodding along, if something is crystallizing, maybe this is the moment to make sure you don't lose this thread. Subscribe and keep this conversation going. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you're at the end of your life, you're looking back, you have plenty of money left. You were never reckless, never irresponsible. You did everything right according to the rules you absorbed about how to live properly. But as you review the memories, you notice something disturbing. There aren't many, not real ones, not moments where you felt fully alive, fully present, fully engaged with the experience of being human. Instead, there are spreadsheets, plans, projections, scenarios you prepared for that never came, and a deep, unshakable sense of having missed something essential. Not because you made wrong choices, because you made safe ones. And safe doesn't equal lived. Now, imagine the alternative version. Less money at the end, more risk along the way. But also more texture, more presence, more memories of times you felt so alive, it almost hurt. Times you took the trip, even though it wasn't optimal. Times you spent on experiences that changed you. Times you chose connection over accumulation. Times you felt your mortality not as terror, but as invitation to be here more fully. Which version do you actually want to be? Because you're building one of them right now. With every choice, every time you defer or engage, every time you optimize or experience, you're constructing the story you'll tell yourself at the end. And that story is either going to be about how well you prepared for a life you never lived, or how fully you lived the life you had. The paradox is that preparation feels like life when you're doing it. It feels productive, important, real. You're doing something, making progress, getting somewhere, but preparation isn't life. It's the preamble to life.